Hi, welcome. I'm Haridas. This is my 7th live stream, but the last one I did, I had all sorts of technical issues. So even though I've still got it up at the moment, please ignore it because everything I said in those, I'm going to kind of, at least the main part of this, the story part, I'm going to repeat again this evening. What I'm doing is I'm sharing is some chants, some sacred chants, and a couple of songs that I've written with my friend Pranaji with the Bindu Babas, and a talk. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Namaste. First, actually, I'm going to chant 3 Oms to align myself with the divine, and you can join in. And Omkara, Om, the root of all Vedic mantras, and universal, used by Hindus and Buddhists and Jains. And after 3 Oms, I'm going to do some prayers to my teachers and my lineage, and then I will start. Om. Om Ajnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshumilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swavadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Juta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sahagrajatam Sahaguna Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Harijana Sahitam Shri Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahaguna Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Shri Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavanishwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Bhaja Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om. I started a little later tonight due to the request of one of my dear friends, Jean, and I'm going to see if that's kind of works with people. So as soon as you hear me, please send a little message so I can see that you're here. Thank you, it'd be really nice. Okay, I'm going to sing, and the chants, they are in call and response, and I'm going to sing quite a popular bhajan, Radha Ramana Hari Bol. And Radha Raman is a very beautiful, in fact, my favorite deity form of Krishna, very small, and is in the town of Vrindavan, Krishna's place, in the district of Mathura, not far from Delhi, and was established under 400 years ago, and by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, and he was worshipping a stone called a Shalagram Shila, and he wanted to kind of worship Krishna in his more knowable form, and the Krishna manifested from the stone in this beautiful form of Radha Raman. And I often share pictures. Photographers and the temple there, they distribute pictures of the daily pujas, which is done by families that are connected for hundreds of years. That they worship the temple in for a few months. One family does, then another family does it. They share the worship, that's the word. Okay, please join me. Hari Bol. Jai Penny and Mark, Hari Bol. Radha Ramana, Hari Bol. Okay, just change that. So please join with me. Call and response. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. 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 Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana 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 Hari Bol. Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. 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 Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. 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 Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe Radhe Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe Radhe Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Jai Jai Shri Radhe. Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. 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 Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana 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 Hari Bol. Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hari Bol. Radhe 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 Jai 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 Shri Radhe. Radhe 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 Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe Radhe Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe 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 Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe 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 Radhe, Jai Shri 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 Radhe, Radhe 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 Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe 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 Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Radhe Japo Chale Aayenge Bihari, Radhe Radhe Japo Chale Aayenge Bihari, Aayenge Bihari Chale Aayenge Bihari, Aayenge Bihari Chale Aayenge Bihari, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Radhe Japo Chale Aayenge Bihari, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Sham Sham, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Sham Sham, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Sham Sham, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Sham Sham, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Sham Sham, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Sham, Shama Sham, Radhe Radhe, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Jai Shri Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe, Radhe Radhe, Radhe Radhe, Jai Shri Radhe Shyam. Bolo Shri Krishna Bhagavan ki Jai, Radharani Maharani ki Jai, Vrindavana Dham ki Jai. Hare Krishna. Few people tuning in there. Lovely to see some friends there. I'm going to sing one more song. I'm going to sing a chant. I've also got a lot of my friends aren't just lovers of Krishna, they love Shiva as well, and I love Shiva. I have a deep connection with Shiva. And so I'm going to sing this composition, Om Namah Shivaya. quite simple. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. And then I sing another bit. Bom Bom Bole Namah Shivaya. Hara Hara Mahadeva. It's my own composition. Namah Shivaya, Om 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 Namah Shivaya. Om Bhole Namah Shivaya, Hara Hara Mahadeva. 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 Namah Shivaya, Shivaya, Hara Hara Jai Shambhu Bholanath. I'm going to do my Bob Marley one, because it doesn't matter if you... I'm kind of, I have to say personally, I'm not putting much of my head into what's going on at the moment. All this stuff, the tension and the anxiety and this situation that's going on in the world. And I have a lot of love and sympathy for all of the people who are really challenged and suffering. I watched the program on BBC yesterday, all the musicians for all the National Health Service and all the people on the front line. And I just went to the supermarket and all the incredible people and the waste disposal people going out there right on the front line, where millions and millions and billions of us around the world are sitting at home, not been going to go out for various reasons. And I'm not going to get into all of the ins and outs of all of that, but here we all are, and I'm taking advantage, like lots of my dear friends are, with the silver linings, appreciating the clean air and the weather, and at least at the moment that the fact that we have internet and we can talk and share, and just saw beautiful sharing from my lovely friend Georgina, beautiful work that she's been doing with looping with her voice and sounds fantastic, and Darren's been doing his work, and he was doing his peace meditations, now he's doing his DJ groovy stuff, which is fantastic. And Madhava's been doing stuff. So these are some of my close friends, and around the world everyone's been sharing, so I'm taking advantage of that, and peace and love basically. And I'm just going to, but not denying that there are problems in the world, but not to let them overwhelm us, but to stay positive and counteract that by positive vibes and protecting yourself, and to send those vibes out into the world. So here we are, Bob Marley going into Jai Shri Ram. Okay, wait a minute. I've got to turn that one down. Excuse me while I just cheer. much trouble in the world. So much trouble in the world. Bless my eyes this morning. The sun is on the rise once again. The way things are going, anything can happen, 'cause they're sailing on their ego trips. Blast off on their spaceship, miles from reality. No care for you, no care for me. So much trouble in the world. There is so much trouble in the world. All you gotta do is give a little, give a little, give a little bit one more time, yeah, yeah, yeah. Bolo, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, 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 Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai 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 Ram, Jai Jai Ram. All you've gotta do is give a little, give a little, give a little bit one more time, yeah, 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 yeah. Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, 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 Shri Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. Bolo Shri Ramachandra Bhagavan ki jai. Hi everybody, welcome. For people who are just tuning in and who will see this in the future, old friends and new friends, and people who don't know who I am, I'm Haridas. I've been doing a whole bunch of live shares live stream shares, and some songs, some chants, and a talk. Now, it's quite a long talk. It's been going on for quite a few sessions. And unfortunately, my last one that I did a couple of days ago, there was so much interference and glitches. Even though I've still got it up, I don't bother looking at it. I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to kind of repeat again today, at least a lot of the ground that I covered. Never can tell the story exactly the same twice, can one? It's a big subject that I've been studying, and it's the center of the talk is what's in a name. My name, Maturadas. I've just noticed I've got my name, Ram Nrsimha there. He's got the name Ram Nrsimha. He's an English gentleman, and I'm English, and somehow we all ended up with these Indian names. How did all of that come about? And I've explained this historical process that's brought the East and the West over hundreds of years closer together, to the time of the British Empire, Calcutta, certain characters and individuals that appeared in the Victorian period, and then the late Victorian period going on into the 20th century, notably the three main characters that are going to be involved in this lineage coming towards me that I'm going to connect with in 1973. But in my story, we're not quite there yet. The story has gone through Kedarnath Dutt in the latter part of from the mid part of the 1970 to the end, and then his son Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the founder of the Gaudiya Mutt, and the guru of Abhay Charan Day, who was going to become Abhay Charanaravinda A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Prabhupada is the title that came later. I've explained a lot of if you, anybody who's missed my talk can go to my previous talks. I've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and this is the sixth one, really carrying on. It's involving the story, two main historical ripples, I call them, that kind of came into my life and kind of collided, and not just me, but a whole a sub-branch of the baby boom generation, such as myself, people like famous people like George Harrison, and all sorts of people who got involved with Indian, specifically spirituality. And the other ripple that collided was the psychedelic ripple effect. And I suppose the reason I'm so excited to tell this story is because it is, as I've grown in life and I've written a biography that's not published yet, I had to look deeply at my life, and certain things happened to me, very crucial things. If one looks at the main timelines of one's life, there are certain things which are crucial that led one to different places. And I haven't dealt really with my childhood or anything. I've dealt with, my story is kind of going to connect with the bigger story. I've been concentrating on the bigger story so far, and how that's going to, because all of these stories, they start with an individual or a group, and it just an esoteric group with an idea, and they grow and they expand, and then they influence, and they can influence thousands of people, millions of people, in the time that they live and afterwards into generations to come. Such is the case with all the prophets and avatars as well. They come, they have a teaching, they show something, and then their followers take it off, and it goes on for hundreds of years, for good or for evil. But we're not trying to judge anything specifically at this time. We're just trying to kind of trace the links about why and how things happened and came about, because things don't just come from nowhere. There's a process, and one thing leads on to another. And we've already traced the journey of Bhaktivedanta Swami. I've just got I have to say, all of the talk up to now, I've really been ad-libbing it based on memory. I did a lot of more study on this over 10 years ago, and even before that on psychedelic literature, history, and I just absorbed that because I was fascinated in it, and haven't really kind of looked it up, but I wanted to get a few dates right. So today I did a little bit of checking, and Prabhupada left India, Calcutta, in August I think, August 1965. And then it took him a few weeks on the boat journey to arrive in New York. While he was on this journey and his long preparation that I've explained, that got him to a free passage on this boat, Jaladuta, that left from Calcutta and was coming to America. He had just a few rupees, some symbols, his copies of the Bhagavatam, and one address in Pennsylvania. And there was, if you want to, any of these stories, if you want to go, you can go on the net and go into infinite detail about every one of these stories. I'm just giving an overview of what happened. It's quite fascinating. I learned some things today about how little things made things happen. Prabhupada almost didn't get the way to leave India. He got normally to leave and get sponsorship, you had to have an institution, and this was just a person. And there was also many hiccups, but at the last minute, he just got that, and he got this and got that. Got on the boat, had 2 heart attacks on the boat. 68 years old, 69, coming up to 70, coming on the order of his spiritual master, and he's coming into America, basically, because that's the order of his guru. Now, the psychedelic ripple that I've been talking about on my last talks started in 1945, you could say. Yesterday or the day before was Bicycle Day. It's called Bicycle Day now because that's the day when Albert Hofmann inadvertently or accidentally or synchronistically discovered LSD 25 as a chemist, and it went into his bloodstream. Anyway, that's gone through a whole process from that discovery. It's gone out from Sandoz laboratories to various psychiatric units around the world for people to test it, because it's got very unusual properties to do with the mind and consciousness, and it's extremely strong. One only needs to have about 200 micrograms, millionths of a gram, for this to become extremely strong and extremely powerful. And I've also explained the people that were using this drug were also military, the CIA, and also in England. They were dying to test out all sorts of different drugs for all sorts of kind of not very nice reasons. And in fact, when the book called Acid Dreams, CIA, LSD and the 60s Rebellion, which deals with Operation MkUltra and the relationship between the 60s and all sorts of things going on, when the Freedom of Information's Act came out in the 70s, there was a dossier that they had, and it was a CIA dossier, and it was LSD 25, potential new agent for unconventional warfare. That's kind of what the CIA were looking at about it. Meanwhile, LSD was being used in a therapeutic healing way by people like Humphrey Osmond, who was going to give mescaline to Aldous Huxley, who was going to write Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. And there were a couple. Sidney Cohen was a researcher also into psychedelics, and Oscar Janiger. His work didn't come out because he didn't publish it, but there was all sorts of research going on, and Cary Grant and some other Hollywood people had great success in psychedelic therapy, and it was hardly being mentioned. Now, the 2 main characters who I keep coming back to, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, they started their experiments at Harvard University over a couple of years in the early 60s. They started with psilocybin, and then this very unusual, there's a lot of strange characters involved in this story. Some of them are really strange, and hard to define the shade of good, bad. Who were they working for? What was their role in the scheme of things? A lot of it's up for grabs, and I'm not going to give an analysis, but they were there. And one of the most interesting guy was Michael Hollingswood. That's not his Hollingshead. That's not his actual name. It was an assumed name. And he, with a friend of his called Barrister, they managed to, before LSD became illegal in the middle of the 1966, they managed to get some Sandoz LSD, a gram, which is like, you can do lots of, and they shared it between them. And part of that LSD, Aldous Huxley got LSD from Alan Hollingshead. He'd had mescaline, and then he actually recommended that he give it to Timothy Leary, and then that's how Timothy Leary got LSD and went from psilocybin to LSD, and it's much easier to use. It's much more stronger in and big doses, and that's how kind of it went. And Hollingshead kind of was a very peculiar character, and he got very attached to Leary. And then, as I explained, Pandora's box got open when Leary and Alpert got kicked out of the university. And before that, it was really, and these other people, Cohen and Jeniger, their research was very, they weren't waving big banners and telling everybody about it. A few things had come out in the press about LSD, but it hadn't. Nobody at this time thought it was going to become a cult phenomena or something that was going to affect the whole world and become big and popular. In fact, it's such a strong experience that most mature people who took it could never conceive that this is something that would be popular, because it's so challenging and it's such a deep experience and so profound it can be. And very ambiguous. This is one of the key words with the whole nature of psychedelics. They're very ambiguous because basically, at the end of the day, they're chemicals, and then there's also natural drugs. And these things are all the results that one gets from them, psychedelics, are they can do everything in their opposite. They're very hard to pin down. You know, they can make you happy, they can make you sad, they can make you hot, they can make you cold, they can, you know, even hashish and mild psychedelics, psychotropics, they can have this strange ambiguous nature, and so it's very hard to pin them down. But there we have it. But people who had taken them under quite controlled settings and they kind of had a bit of maturity about what was going on, had very, very good experiences. But not everybody agreed with the kind of the methodology of dropping psychedelics like that Timothy Leary developed. He actually took it upon himself to be the spokesman for LSD after the Harvard University thing. He just started his thing, really. And that's when it started to grow and grow, because he started to advertise it, he started to talk about it, he started to promote it. And I explained before, there was Ken Kesey on the other side who wrote One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, and they had a different kind of approach to it on that side, on the West Coast. They're set and setting, but a different type of set and setting. It was a bit more chaotic, but involving music and lights, and yes, it was more bohemian. There's books being written by people involved with both these sides. The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe about Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. And there's a very interesting book by another chap who was at the place where Timothy Leary went, that was given to him by Bill Hitchcock, who was a member of the Memon family, a big estate called Millbrook. And there's a bit of the Christian movement that gets in, you know, members of the Christian movement get to kind of connected to the story even in those early days. And that kind of the Millbrook thing kind of went on really through the from the about 63 onwards to about 67. And there's Art Klepps has written a book about the experience, and there was different people. There was another guy called Bill Haynes who had his group, and Timothy Leary, maybe because he had a kind of, a lot of people were reacting against their roots. Many people had Ramdas they came from Jewish, some people came from Christian, some people from nothing, and many people were rejecting their religious upbringings and had more scientific interpretations of reality. And Leary was not so much inclined to a kind of a theistic perspective in the spiritual realm of things. It's interesting because one of the main players, who I haven't mentioned yet, was a chap who kind of was up with Humphrey Osmond in Canada at the beginning, a guy called Al Hubbard. And he had a connection with the military industry, and he looked like a real redneck, real kind of square looking guy. And he's another unusual, interesting chap who's often been called the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. He got hold of a whole bunch of LSD through somebody connected with the military, and he went around the world turning on really famous people. It was all kind of top secret, politicians, military people. He was on his mission, but he was not at all into the format that Timothy Leary had. Timothy Leary had developed a format based around as a manual to guide people, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And he had written a kind of modern interpretation version of that called The Psychedelic Experience, and wrote a few other little books along with Ramdas, who wasn't Ramdas yet, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner. And it was that book that John Lennon got a copy of from the Indica Bookshop in London, ran by Barry Miles, who was a very important person in this whole kind of cultural expansion and counterculture, which was a kind of turning point from the Beat generation, from the immediate post-war generation that was going to go into the creation of what were going to become hippies. Beats was a very minority kind of group, but they did have a lot of influence because they were poets and writers. And as I've been explaining, paradigm shifts are very much accelerated and enhanced by have become enhanced by technology in India, in the Victorian period with the printing of literature, and then in the modern period with technology such as radio and television and the record player and music. And this is where culture, knowledge, information, trends were spreading rapidly through technology. And so this is what happened. Bookshops were beginning to open. There were City Lights in San Francisco, and there was Indica in London. And these were little pockets of esoteric knowledge. And also developing at this time was the... in America, they had... in England, we had a movement that was establishment and anti-war, because everyone was suffering from nuclear paranoia from the end of the Second World War, and famous people like Bertrand Russell were involved, and they involved peace marches, ban the bomb, going from the nuclear place in England of the British called Aldermaston to London. And they had huge amounts, and they described them as the Duffel Coat Brigade. And you can see pictures of the kind of beatnik-inspired students, poetic intellectuals of the time that would wear duffel coats and have beards and play guitars. And they weren't hippies quite yet. It was something slightly different at this time. And you can see thousands of them going on these marches, walking, people from all over the world with little banners, Sweden, Spain, England. There was a group of people developing after the war, people who were anti-establishment, they were anti-war. We had suffered from the First World War and Second World War. People had gone off into these senseless wars, millions of people dying and suffering, and people had enough of it. People were having enough of it. They developed the ban the bomb sign, and the word peace was in the air, basically. So I'm just trying to explain what was happening in the culture. Prabhupada's just arriving in 1965. LSD was spreading. Michael Hollingshead, they kind of got sick of him there at Millbrook, and they kind of sent him off to England, and he went and set up the Psychedelic Institute, whatever it was called, centre in London. It was just a pad, really, and a lovely house with, decked out nice. And apparently all sorts of really interesting people, like Paul McCartney and Donovan and other people went there, and they got turned on. And it was also through some of the acid that he had brought. The dentist from John Lennon and George Harrison spiked them with some acid, and that's how they got their first trip. And I've also was explaining that the parallel story with LSD is the marijuana story, because it's all woven in together. The Western culture has always been predominantly a big booze alcohol culture, and there have been little small pockets of poets and intellectuals who have dabbled in hashish and mescaline that had been developed earlier from a derivative from the cactus. Not many people, and a few people into opium. There were these little places, but it was very, very small, very, very few people. But what happened was with the jazz music in the 20s and 30s, marijuana became very, very, very popular, all amongst the black people mostly, and a lot of white people in the jazz scene. And it was all undercover. And there's also lots and lots of books about this. And I gave an anecdote. I'll repeat it again. I just saw it the other day. Eric Burdon from the Animals, when he was young, quite young, in the very early 60s. Louis Armstrong came through Newcastle, where he lived, and he was so wanted to go and see him, but he couldn't get a ticket. He was too young. He was hanging outside the door, a back door, and this one of the musicians in the group, trombone player, he kind of liked him, and he said, "Come on, I'll get you in." And took him in, and he took him through this place into a room, and he said that Louis Armstrong was just sitting on a chair with a big spliff, a joint. You know, he was exposed to this at this time. Louis Armstrong was a very famous, well-known marijuana smoker. But the governments in America, to kind of persecute minority groups, they kind of demonized it. And there's a whole other story about that connected with DuPont and the other part of the hemp family. Marijuana is hemp. That's a part of another big story. But all these things were going on, marijuana. And also in England, the Rastafarians, not just Rastafarians, Jamaicans, had been arriving in the 50s to England, and they had brought ganja, marijuana, with them. And the intellectuals and bohemians of the jazz scene in England, like George Melly and in the Soho area, they were smoking marijuana. It was quite popular at that time. Okay. And then also in 1965, what was happening is that there was this. You see, I was a teenager in the 60s, basically, and a lot of the other people I'm talking about are much older than me. They're like 20, 30 years old, much more. But they're the ones that kind of influencing all of us young. The Beatles are just 10 years older, and so in England, what was happening in England was it was happening in a different pace than it was happening in America, but things were expanding, and there was a youth culture that started in the 60s that hadn't been there before. It was a brand new kind of phenomena. And youth suddenly had spending power. They were the dictators of fashion, and young people wanted to wear different clothes. They wanted to listen to different music. That kind of started with rock and roll, and American musicians coming over to England, and the groups like the Beatles and all the groups that would come the part of that scene. They were all getting influenced by the rock and roll music, and later, a little bit also at the same time, the blues, especially the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, and people like Eric Clapton and all of those. They were getting, and Eric Burdon, they're all becoming influenced by the blues. It was and all the things that go along with all of that culture. It's you know, cultures and subgroups and youth movements go through fashion trends, and it spreads by wildfire. Little magazines, types of music you hear. And so in 1965, Barry Miles, who was a kind of important part of this, he'd become friends with William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, who were the two of the main beat poets, along with Jack Kerouac, who was the most famous, who actually wrote his famous book On the Road in 1949. But even that didn't get really out and get published until much later in the late 50s. And Allen Ginsberg was very much instrumental in getting his book printed. And through these literatures, ideas and trends spread. And so a lot of those people on those Aldermaston walks and everything, they were all kind of influenced by this literature. And Barry Miles had this big poetry gathering, and I saw a big documentary on it. And for people in England at that time who were isolated in universities and scattered all over, they didn't really have, they had maybe a few little friends that got together, but there was no kind of like movement or group thing happening. And that meeting at Albert Hall was quite phenomenal. I think about 6,000 people came from all over England to that poetry reading, and Allen Ginsberg was there, and he recited his famous poem Howl. And there were a lot of other poets. There was this other interesting chap called Simon Vinkenode from Holland, who I get to meet many years later. He was a good friend of the Krishna ashram in Amsterdam. Considered a bit like the Timothy Leary of Holland, and he was a poet. And when you look at them then, Allen Ginsberg, okay, he had long hair and beard. Most of the others looked quite kind of still had short hair. Some of them, they wore ties. They looked reasonably smart. But Simon Vinkenode was kind of actually at that, even though looking quite straight, even in 65, was high on psychedelics at that time. So it was spreading, okay? And what really made as I mentioned before, that in San Francisco, on the West Coast, you had Timothy Leary had moved into Millbrook on the East Coast, and Ken Kesey had his scene going on the West Coast. Now, this phenomena happened where the government made LSD illegal. Up to that time, LSD had all come from Sandoz Laboratory, and they'd been kind of told not to just give it out. They've got somebody who told them, you just can't give this stuff out to anybody. It started to get more and more difficult. But there were characters, and one of the main characters in this story was a chap called Oswald Owsley III, nicknamed the Bear. And he was a kind of genius, mad, eccentric genius. And he'd had LSD, loved it. But then it was like, well, what are we going to do now? Where are we going to get our acid from? So he just went to the university and got a whole bunch of books and figured out how to make it. And he took a bit of money from some friends and everything. And when he kind of like showed other people were experimenting, trying to make, but his LSD really hit the mark. And gradually, that everybody just wanted to have his acid kind of took over the market, and he was making it in big enough quantities to be able to do that. So he was supplying Ken Kesey, and Ken Kesey got connected with Allen Ginsberg, and also got connected with one of the great characters from the Beat Generation, Neil Cassidy, who was going to become a driver on the psychedelic bus of Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey always said about himself that he was kind of like too young to be a beat and too old to be a hippie. He was kind of had his role in the middle. And Timothy Leary, even though he was considered like the guru of the hippies, he was in his own category. And they all had different kind of ways and approaches to the whole psychedelic experience and the influence that they had on the culture at that time. In San Francisco, around that area, Oswald Owsley, who made the acid, was really into the Grateful Dead, and he also created their sound systems for them. And it was through him and the light shows and everything that they started having these acid tests, and more people would take acid and go to these events, happenings that these kind of term happenings were created at this time, because this is what it was. And really, without these enhancers, these psychedelic drugs, it was all based on the psychedelic experience. It was a wave. It was something in the planets, in the stars, that was guiding this whole mission with these psychedelic drugs. And I'm not specifically going to say psychedelics gave all the answers and all this. Not at all. That's not part of what my story is. I'm going to give a judgment maybe, or about the nature of them and what they are, because they are very ambiguous. I'm just talking about actually just what happened. And whatever LSD did was, one of the things that it did was it opened doors, and it opened people to the possibilities of other dimensions, other aspects of the self, other realities, other ways of looking at things. And from that, lots of people who got early on involved with the ecology movement of things, a lot of it was based on their psychedelic experience, where they actually had an experience of feeling connected with nature, to the planet. They kind of got out of their modern materialistic mindset that had been created by the consumer society, and also the paranoia of the post-war McCarthy, paranoia of communism, the atom bomb. And within all this was a kind of a whole new cultural movement, started with the Beats and then kind of moving into the hippies, though the hippies hadn't quite arrived yet. That was going to happen as we go from 1965 into 66. They're all very crucial, these dates. It seems like an epoch, but it's just like just a few years. Things started to accelerate in England and America and the whole world. But the epicenter was kind of, at this time, was San Francisco, a little bit over there with Timothy Leary, but it was all happening on a much more bigger cultural sense in San Francisco, because music was involved. And also, guess what? The media, the press, they got hold of it and started talking about all these acid tests. And of course, it just attracted lots and lots of young people from all over America who were interested, because this is what the kind of the leaders and the people of their generation were getting involved with and telling everyone. It was being spread through underground magazines, the Berkeley Barb, the East Village Other, and soon to be started in England, International Times and Oz Magazine. This is how kind of information was spread amongst the underground. And the music that was coming out of that time was called underground music. It hadn't been kind of taken over yet by and debased, you could say, and sullied by mainstream world. It was still quite in virgin territory at this time, 66, 67. And this is the time when the Beatles are getting turned on to acid, and you can see it through the albums. Slowly, Rubber Soul is kind of hashish, marijuana, and then you get into Revolver, 66, and then it's all building up really, even though psychedelics is there in Revolver, it hasn't really, no one's actually mentioned in the press yet about the popular press, and somewhere someone like me as an 11-year-old in England would get wind of it. This was amongst an esoteric group of people still. That was going to happen in the summer of 67. But as we turned from 76 into 77, this is where the kind of psychedelic, it's already hit in New York, because the first disciples of Bhaktivinoda Swami, who've met him in New York, because he arrived there basically with nothing after spending some months with Ramamurti Mishra, and he ended up in the Bowery part of New York, and through being there got to meet a few kind of bohemian artists that were living there, a couple who'd been to India. And that's how they kind of recognized him on the street and realized that he resembled some of the sadhus and holy men they'd seen when they'd gone to Rishikesh and other places in Varanasi. And they talked to him, and he had started to give classes, attracted disciples. One of those was going to become Mukunda Goswami, who happened to be at college with a friend called Sam Spirster in the earlier 60s, and they were in communication, West Coast, East Coast, about what was going on in the scene and everything. And a few little things were being sent in the post as well, along with all of that. And Mukunda wrote to Sam, his friend Sam, that I think I found this person that we were talking about as somebody who's actually enlightened. Because at that time, as people were taking LSD, you're not necessarily having to take LSD, but they were getting intrigued in yoga, philosophy, and there was Alan Watts there giving incredible talks about and introducing people to Zen and Vedanta, and people were getting interested more and more into spirituality. There were books appearing and people were reading them. Yogananda had already been in, he'd already passed away by this time, but his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, was becoming very popular, and you could go to these alternative bookshops in New York and in San Francisco and get books on various things. So lots of young people were seeking, but no one had really. There were some teachers at that time, and as I'd mentioned before, Krishnamurti was there, but he wasn't really. The hippies weren't really turning into Krishnamurti. He was speaking to a different kind of strata of society. It was a bit too bohemian for that scene, and the main character in this whole story, from the beats to the hippies, and from the hippies with the Krishna and India, is Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg, in the very early days of the Krishna movement in New York, had heard about it because he was tuned into everything that was cool happening, and he came and met Bhaktivinoda Swami and was very impressed because he'd already been chanting Hari Krishna in America, but he didn't really know the philosophy behind it. And here he met somebody who was genuine, authentic, and very sincere, and obviously sincere and an adept of that path and knowledgeable. He had deep knowledge of the Indian texts. And after a conversation with Allen Ginsberg and Prabhupada, I read in one of the very early mimeograph Back to Godhead magazine, it was an article by Allen Ginsberg about the Mahamantra based on what he'd understood after talking with Bhaktivedanta Swami. Before that, he was chanting, but he didn't really know. Ultimately, he had some theological differences with Bhaktivedanta Swami, because Bhaktivedanta Swami was coming with something that was quite different from India, something that had never, up until that time, this period, had been expanded, another path, another tradition that was kind of parallel there in Indian culture, but had differences. He'd had this difference with Ramamurti Mishra, who was more aligned with the Advaita school, and Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta's theistic bhakti teachings were more aligned with the Vashishtadvaita of Ramanuja, and a teaching from his teachings lineage specifically called Achintya Bhed Abheda Tattva. It's all about the nature of Godhead, but I'm going to get into that a little bit later. I'm talking about the circumstances that are leading to things rather than the specifics at this stage. Bhaktivedanta Swami had a lot of things going for him that the other gurus didn't have. First of all, he knew what he was talking about. He had written, he was scholarly and had a deep understanding of the Indian texts. He was an exponent of the chant. He didn't just talk about it, he did it. He led the kirtan. When he came to America, everything came from him. Everything that developed from the Krishna movement developed from this one person who, during that early period, before he'd even really kind of connected with any foreigners, because he struggled for a while, had many times thought about returning. He'd even gone to the place where the boats were, and there's some lovely anecdotes about him going there. And even the gentleman there said, "Swamiji, I don't think you're serious about going. I think you're going to stay here." And there was also some interesting things that had happened in America prior to this. This is in a very interesting book that Stephen Rose and Satyaraj and Brahmananda wrote about the timing, because the Pope had also, just before this, I think 64, maybe in early 65, had visited New York, and they'd made these new kind of edicts in the Catholic Church about being more open to different religions and kind of accepting them. It was the first time in hundreds of years that the Catholic Church had even kind of accepted the validity of other religions. This had kind of thawed a certain general atmosphere. That had happened. And there was some kind of change in the visas and laws in America that just occurred just at the time when Bhaktivedanta Swami came. So if he had come a bit earlier, a lot of things that have happened wouldn't have happened. The timing was all crucial. And of course, Bhaktivedanta Swami was being guided by Krishna, like we all are, and like all the historical processes, and he was just being a servant, and all of this was just incredible synchronicity was just happening. Some people call it Krishnicity. It's a term, synchronicity, coined by Carl Jung, an acausal connecting principle, which is really far out because it's not just based on a mechanistic view of reality. Magic, serendipity was happening all over the place at this time. And so in 66, Bhaktivedanta Swami actually registered the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in 66 and had a few initiated disciples. Mukunda, who became Mukunda, he'd been telling his friend Sam in San Francisco that they were planning to bring Bhaktivedanta Swami over to San Francisco. At the same time as they were planning this, there was also this big, huge event being organized in San Francisco called The Human Being. I think it happened on the 14th of January, 67. This is actually leading up to the summer. It's still in January, but because San Francisco had a better climate than New York, and people could go out and frolic in the park and stuff, it had a very different kind of atmosphere. San Francisco always had an atmosphere of sunshine and fun and surfing, and it had, New York was a bit heavier, the mood of it over there, and the temperature and the climate. And at this event, thousands of hippies had come there for it, had come from all over. There was a lovely poster gathering of the tribes. You can see all the footage. I just checked it out yesterday. You can see Timothy Leary on stage with flowers in his ear, announcing everybody, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And then there's Allen Ginsberg dancing in ecstasy, chanting kirtan and mantras, and other beat poets and kind of gurus of that generation sitting on the stage. And then there was going to be amazing music. And Oswald Owsley had made thousands of LSD trips to give out 3 to a whole package of all these people were just tripping out, basically. A few days later, on the 17th of January, just 3 days after this event, was the day when Bhaktivinoda Swami arrived in San Francisco. There's great pictures of Allen Ginsberg greeting him at the airport. They've got garlands on. Mukunda has arrived. He's come with Bhaktivinoda Swami. But there are these people that are waiting there. Guru Das, he hasn't become Guru Das yet, and Sam hasn't become Shamasundar, but they are shortly to become. And not only that, Shamasundar was very, very well connected because he'd lived in San Francisco before the whole big hippie thing had exploded, and he was very good friends with the whole Grateful Dead scene, Eugene Kesey, all of these people. And it was so electric at that time. Things were happening. It's interesting because the center that eventually became the Krishna Center in San Francisco was right next to one of the most kind of alternative hip groups called the Diggers. Peter Coyote, the famous actor, was kind of part of the Diggers, and it was they were very kind of anarchistic and against the system, and they had a shop where you could just go in and take things, and there was no money, and they were into giving out free food, and the Krishnas were very cool and hip at this time because it was basically just part of it's coming out of the same scene. And Bhaktivinoda Swami in New York had gone through a process with his disciples where it was all kind of slowly he'd introduced the teachings, the philosophy, and the strictures that he'd introduced, which were quite stronger than nearly any of the other gurus and teachers that had come to India. And it worked 2 ways. It kind of put off a lot of people and also attracted a lot of people for the same reasons. Some people thought, wow, to do this, you have to be really sincere, because to get that, you have to kind of renounce this and this and that. And for some people, they weren't prepared to give, because he was asked, there was strictures about sexuality, intoxication, and which were the 2 kind of, like, you could almost say, pillars of the kind of counterculture at that time. Hippies, these gurus of the same. Allen Ginsberg's just the same age as my mother, born in 1926, of my mother's generation, and Prabhupada is the generation of my grandfather, 1896. And people, I was during this time 66. I'm just 10. So, and Shamasundar, he's in his 20s, basically, early 20s, and Mukunda, they're early 20s, and Ken Kesey and those people are a bit older, you see. So it's kind of, and so you can imagine the amount of people that are, if you look at the pictures, most of the people are in their 20s, some people younger, and a lot of them are all kind of college, university students, or people wanting to escape from all of that. And already at that time, some people were beginning to kind of like really seriously drop out and start experimenting with communal living. Some of the houses in San Francisco, people were living together, and art shops were developing, and concerts were developing. These acid tests were happening. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Area, Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Janis Joplin, Quicksilver Messenger, Blue Cheer, certain groups were starting. The West Coast was all starting at that time. The Doors and stuff were meant to come later. And after this, just after this big be-in happening in San Francisco, about, I think it was the 27th of January, they had at the Avalon Ballroom a big concert event. A mantra rock dance was the poster, with Allen Ginsberg there, Bhaktivinoda Swami, and all these different famous groups. They'd all agreed to do the concert to raise some money, and apparently it raised $2,000 in those days to help start the new Krishna Temple Center in San Francisco. And Bhaktivedanta Swami got onto the stage. He was chanting, and it was a big thing. It set a precedent that what was happening around the world was people were beginning this alternative cultures. People were beginning to coalesce. You know, that whole song by let's work together, can't he? Let's work together. Come on, come on. It was all about coming together. Come together right now. It was in the air. Come together, come together. People were feeling this. People who lived at that time, especially with that age, will look back with fond memories, because it was an explosion, really, of enthusiasm. And many people have looked back and said, okay, it was misguided, or it was, people were over enthusiastic. They really thought that they could change the world. And part of this whole thing of changing the world was through, and what was actually accelerating the whole process, apart from technology and music, was this LSD. This was great, and marijuana. These were actually, people could smoke marijuana or ganja, and it was like the peace pipe. It became part of the whole. It was a rite of passage. It's what you did at college and university. In fact, you can trace many people at that time. Their whole spiritual journey starts with their first joint, and then they got involved with that. Then they started to read spiritual books. Then somehow LSD appeared. Then they had LSD, and then their questioning got deeper. And then they decided, I think I should maybe try some yoga and meditation. What's going on in the local area? Is there a little Buddhist center there? Who are those people on the streets chanting mantras? People were getting information and trying and experimenting with different spiritual paths, because doors had been opened with LSD. And as I said, not necessarily answers have been given. Some people actually had extremely profound experiences and connected with the divine essence and presence on those. But then there was always the problem of coming down. And this was going to be a perennial problem for the psychedelic generation. And that whole story, and part of that, becomes epitomized in the journey of Richard Alpert. Because as this Summer of Love developed in 1967, because as Prabhupada was at the beginning of the Summer of Love, it hadn't even started. You can see pictures of Prabhupada footage sitting on Hippie Hill, which was the place in Golden Gate Park. Thousands of hippies were congregating. You can see everyone is quite high, but very positive. You don't hear many negative things at this time, because the setting was very positive, which is a big part of the whole psychedelic experience. There was nothing to be frightened of. Credible, there was going to be this big event in the summer called the Monterey Pop Festival. Mark Phillips from the Mamas and Papas, he helped organize it, and he wrote this song for Scott McKenzie, who he'd been doing music with before the Mamas and Papas. It's just called San Francisco, and there's the famous lines, "If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair." Then there's "All across the nation, there's a strange vibration, oh, people in motion. There's a new explanation from a new generation." This was in the air, and you had the Who in England talking about my generation. There was the younger generation were kind of coming into conflict with the older generation in England and in America. In America, it was more intense, because they were in the process of drafting young men specifically after the Vietnam War. And so this was one of the reasons why Nixon started to make very stringent laws about LSD and marijuana at this time, because it was a way of targeting the generation that was doing the war protests, basically, because that's what everyone was starting to do, and it was growing so beyond anybody's expectation. And this Operation MkUltra that I've mentioned before, they were doing their experiments with LSD. Now, there's all sorts of theories about how the proliferation of LSD happened and why it happened and who was behind it. Some people even believe that even maybe the CIA helped orchestrate it or allowed it to happen. What happened was there was a group of political activists in America who ended up dropping acid like most people, and they realized that just having banners and waving and doing all the traditional stuff wasn't very interesting. And so they got kind of ideas from psychedelia, more aesthetic and artistic. And they were called themselves, the Yippies. And they include famous people, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and there were quite a few others. Now, this a festival of Monterey Pop, Oswald Owsley III, I just saw in the documentary, really, about this period. And his wife, at the time, she said that they actually made 35,000 hits of LSD to give out at the Monterey Pop Festival. And I recommend anybody to go and see it, because it's incredible. There's Jimi Hendrix, who'd just come back from England, being discovered by Chas Chandler. And then there's all this group, Simon and Garfunkel, Mamas and the Papas, Otis Redding, Country Joe and the Fish, Canned Heat. It goes on. All the groups that were big at that time. And the people still had quite short hair at that time. And there was a character I mentioned the other day called Gypsy Boots. You can see him in the audience. He was a member of the Nature Boys, which were another influence on the hippie movement, not just the beatniks. They weren't really into they weren't as decadent as the beatniks. They were more into yoga and meditation and health foods. And they all had long hair and beards long before hippies, basically in the 40s. And they were influenced by a movement from Germany that people like Hermann Hesse had been involved, a natural movement. And some of the original founders of that movement had come to California because of the beautiful climate. So that was part of this story of what was going to make kind of hippies an alternative. People, being a vegetarian in those days was unusual in the West. It had always been unusual, even though there had been eccentric pockets of people who had been getting involved in vegetarianism. And that was one of the things that was very attractive about the Krishna movement at that time, was that Prabhupada had brought a philosophy, he'd brought a mantra, a form of music that accompanied the mantra chanting. It wasn't just a kind of private meditation. And he'd brought the culture, which is very prevalent in India, especially in the culture of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, of cooking devotional vegetarian food, offering it to Krishna and distributing it. It's called prasadam. It's one of the big things that one does in India. One goes to a holy temple, and the priests and the people in the worship the temple have offered something to the god, and it's been blessed by the gods, and it's distributed and sanctified. And that's what was very popular and attractive, because the food and the recipes that Prabhupada brought were delectable. And some people, it freaked them out because it wasn't as dull and boring as the macrobiotic diet that had been kind of introduced there at that time. Some people were experimenting with that. And in fact, right at the beginning, Prabhupada used to do everything himself. He would lead the kirtans, do the chants, give the talk, cook the food, and even give it out. But that, of course, the disciples, students realized that he shouldn't be doing all that. And so they began to learn how to cook and assist Prabhupada in his activities. But he taught everything. Everything came from Prabhupada. This whole movement, International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Try to remember, he's in his late 60s, you see. He hasn't even turned 70 yet. And of these disciples, people that met Prabhupada in San Francisco, Shamasundar, He was with his partner, who became Malati. They'd been together before they met. They joined kind of together, and they had a daughter called Saraswati, who became named Saraswati. And then there was Gurudas, and he's written a whole bunch of books. They're beautiful. He'd been on a whole journey with the peace movement and with Bohemians and artists to lead him to that point as well. And then you had Mukunda, who'd come over. Now Shamasundar, who I only just got to meet recently, has written a couple of fantastic books. It's more in the pipeline about his story, about how he met Prabhupada. And he had an extremely a valuable, important role to play in the spreading of the Krishna movement, and that was going to influence the much bigger world than it was focused on now. Now it's just a handful of people in New York and San Francisco. I'm not sure if Montreal's just about to come after this, the center. And just at this time, so Shamasundar, when he describes in his book, Chasing Rhinos with the Swami, he gives a lot of background information to what was happening in San Francisco at that time to lead up to him getting involved with meeting Bhaktivedanta Swami, and how basically these early disciples, they'd never met anybody like him. Nobody had seen anybody like Prabhupada. And what's interesting, because there's this phenomena, charismatic leaders. And one of the people that have studied this phenomenon, it could be in any Max Weber. One of the things I found, not that I'm a great scholar and studied him deeply, but one thing I read from him was that it is the followers of charismatic leaders that legitimize them, and that kind of allows their charisma that's kind of latent to kind of manifest, because leaders and followers, they need both of each other. Like charismatic rock lead people, like say Mick Jagger, without a whole group of fans, who is Mick Jagger? And the fans can only be fans if they've got someone to kind of worship or praise, or people give up hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get a front row seat to see Mick Jagger, and give up, and there's an exchange of energy that goes. Anyway, Bhaktivedanta Swami, his charisma was manifesting at this time. He was not running back to India. He'd got disciples. He was in the process of fulfilling the order, and he was seeing Krishna as the destiny that he had been given, the duty and the service he had been given by his spiritual man, manifesting before his eyes. In fact, he actually, in his spiritual vision, he saw his disciples as kind of representatives of his guru, basically coming to if you read Shamasundar's book, you get really deep and you understand the phenomenal potency and incredible nature and personality of Srila Prabhupada. In different books by different disciples of Bhaktivedanta Swami, you get to see different sides of his personality. Shamasundar was such a type of person that you get to see a very interesting side of Bhaktivedanta Swami, and what he tapped into was this magic and the energy that surrounded him, that Prabhupada's so much faith in Krishna was that he kind of surrendered and did things, and he was just waiting, knowing that Krishna was going to come in and work everything out, and Krishna was going to come in and play his magic, and he tapped into that, and he wanted to kind of follow that path of Bhaktivedanta. He wanted to kind of like assist Bhaktivedanta Swami in and taste that magic, because that's what kind of excited him, the magic energy that he found around Bhaktivedanta Swami. So he got it into his head. So Bhaktivedanta Swami spent some time there, and I think he also went back to New York and then went back to India for some time. But while he was off doing this, the devotees, who hardly had any training at this time, they'd already developed enough faith in Bhaktivedanta Swami that they'd taken up his practices. And what was keeping everybody if you see the posters and pamphlets at this time, it was all for the hippies. It was stay high forever, chant Hari Krishna. People had taken acid and had these experiences, and I was like, okay, it was interesting. I had some far out stuff, but there's something behind this. I need to get into this in a different level. And there were the Hari Krishnas, basically. Suddenly you could go to their temple, there were some books, you could get some prasad, and then there were these people that were following these quite strict rules. They were getting up very early in the morning, when most people were, just going to bed after tripping out. And that's what Allen Ginsberg had recommended to lots of the hippies who had mostly been tripping, because it's a very long experience, LSD. It's quite exhausting. Even Paul McCartney was saying he took quite a few trips, but then he got exhausted because it's so long and it needs a lot of stamina. And so people who'd maybe dropped in an early evening, by the morning they were kind of coming down from their trip. And Allen Ginsberg had recommended go to the Krishna temple, re-enter into your body, stabilize yourself, and hear this. So people used to do that. And even later on in Amsterdam, when I lived in Amsterdam, because there was a lot of hippies there, people used to come early in the morning, stumble off the streets and come into our early morning kirtans and be amazed. You could see that they'd been out of their heads, and they would just be amazed at these kind of ceremonies, bells, conch shells, and mantras. Chanting of mantra. Now, the amazing thing about this process that Prabhupada brought is that it worked. And that's why lots of young people were flocking. Prabhupada had so much faith in the holy name, the Maha Mantra, that had been predicted to be one of the most potent ways or the most potent way to understand God in the Vedic literatures in this age. And through the chanting had its own magic. And while he'd been in New York, he'd made a recording called Krishna Consciousness on the Happening album. And interestingly, some copies of that album George Harrison had procured them. And George Harrison had been listening to the Hari Krishna mantra, this recording of Prabhupada, and John Lennon, but they'd never met any Krishna devotees up until this time. In fact, when George Harrison visited San Francisco in '67, he was a bit it had got so big and unruly and so kind of ungraceful that it had already kind of expanded and been exploited at the volume level of it. And there were a lot of confused creative people going around who were just, and also the mafia and a lot of nasty things had moved in to the area. And there was a lot of strange drugs going around, and also people kind of abusing the psychedelic experience and other drugs as well. And it kind of turned him off a little bit. And even though San Francisco, for this kind of one summer, it kind of blossomed and there was this innocence. And even in the bit of paper that I read with the Monterey Pop video and literature, it mentions that it's quite that it's in the, if you see the Monterey Pop Festival, which has this incredible finale with Ravi Shankar and Alaraka taking the whole audience into a mass ecstasy, it was ephemeral. It lasted for like a summer, this kind of positive thing, but it kind of started to morph already. Like everything in life, there's a shadow. And it's another idea of Jung. We have personal shadows and there are collective shadows. And there was a collective shadow happening with the hippie thing, because there's starting to be thousands of people involved in this movement, thousands and thousands of people. And it's not organized, it's not disciplined. And that's why a lot of people found shelter in the Krishna ashrams, because there was quite a rigid discipline. And brains had become scattered by this chaotic lifestyle that had been generated through the kind of beginning, the sprouting of the counterculture. Some people already kind of, I'm out of San Francisco, and they're going to the Morning Star Ranch and other communes and different places that were outside. People wanted to really take Timothy Leary's statement, turn on, tune, drop out, literally. And so people were going that far and dropping out. And so George Harrison was chanting Hare Krishna. Shama Sundar, he was thinking, what can we do? How can we help Swamiji? How can we help this amazing mantra? And he had this idea, because in the beginning of late 68, I think, that's when the Beatles went to Rishikesh and to meet this other guru who had already been in the West, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and had developed a system that he had called Transcendental Meditation. Now, interestingly, Maharishi's guru was actually the Shankaracharya of Joshimath in India, which is the kind of different spiritual lineage than the Gaudiya Vaishnavas from India, and out of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, many interesting personalities and things have come, such as Deepak Chopra and his father, connected with Ayurveda, and that has kind of had its roots with Maharishi in Rishikesh, and what was the other thing? There was lots of jazz musicians. Anyway, the Beatles went over there to spend some time there, and it's famously known that many of the tracks for the White Album of the Beatles were conceived there. It was for John Lennon and the other members of the Beatles. It was kind of the first time for quite a few years they'd been kind of clean. They started to, follow some kind of regime of an ashram. Donovan was there, and members of the Beach Boys were there. Mia Farrow was there, and her sister. And there's all sorts of stories. There's a very interesting book called Beyond Gurus, written by a lady who was an early disciple of Maharishi from the early 60s. So the Beatles already had, I think George got introduced by Pattie Boyd, his wife, first to it. That's, for me, as a Westerner, the first time I'd ever heard, and many of us heard the name meditation, was through Maharishi and through the Beatles' contact. And the Beatles had met Maharishi in England and then gone to India and then come back. And there's all sorts of stories about that time that they spent there. So, and of the Beatles, George was the one most attracted to Indian culture and the spirituality stronger than the others. And he had made a connection with Ravi Shankar, the great Indian sitarist. And that's very, very interesting, the whole story with music and culture, and the fact that Ravi Shankar introduced, in fact, Ravi Shankar mentions that after his concert at Monterey Pop, the audience is completely changed. Up until then, it had been mostly quite straight people involved in either jazz or classical music. And suddenly he'd, overnight, really, since when that movie came out, he became a superstar, really. And then George Harrison had used sitar a bit on The Inner Light on Revolver, but it wasn't until the summer of '67, when Sgt. Pepper's came out on the 1st of June, that LSD kind of, and the psychedelic vibe was kind of exploded, because it wasn't just a sound. The production, there's documentaries written about how incredible and what a breakthrough this album was. It influenced recording all over the world, and in time it's they call it a water point in between things. George Martin is very instrumental in creating that sound. And also, before they even did Sgt. Pepper's, there was a big event at the Alexander Palace, which was called the Technicolor Show, a psychedelic show or something. I can't remember the name. And it was to raise money for money for a newspaper that Barry Miles, who owned the Indica shop, was partially involved with. It was called International Times, and that was an event to raise money for International Time. So what's going on? You've got Monterey Pop, you've got this thing, Ali Pali, and then you had the poet thing, and people are coming together, San Francisco, and then in London, you've got these kind of, at that time, it was, you had Kings Road, Carnaby Street for fashion, and then these different clubs started coming, the UFO, the Roundhouse, and these were certain events that started to kind of have psychedelic events, and this is where Pink Floyd started, and they had kind of like obviously got some of their ideas from what the Grateful Dead had been doing with their light shows, and they started to introduce that, and that's where the young people in England who were breaking out of the esoteric small confines of the beat to coming early hippies, and it was getting bigger and bigger, the phenomena. And then a few days after Sgt. Pepper's came out, and this is how I got to really hear the name LSD for the first time, even though I'd heard the name hippie. And And Paul McCartney had got to take LSD a little bit after the other Beatles. And but he had been interviewed by Life magazine, and he admitted talking about LSD. And 2 days later after that, ITN mainstream television prime time had an interview with Paul McCartney telling that he had taken LSD. Okay, so you can see there's different levels of the Pandora's box being opened with the psychedelic phenomena. It starts with Timothy Leary getting kicked out from Harvard University, and then the next major, in terms of my story anyway, is the Paul McCartney, the probably at that time he was my most famous Beatle, and because he was the public face, a publicity speaker really for the Beatles at that time. In this interview, suddenly there we were in suburbia, 11, 12 years old, hearing that Paul McCartney had taken LSD, and suddenly, obviously, and he was criticized for this in the press and future afterwards, that due to his legitimizing it, he was kind of giving his thumbs up to the experience, whether he actually said that or not, but it had that effect. Whether, it's like whatever his motive was for it, but he just wanted, he said, what's the problem with wanting to expand your mind and your consciousness? There are all these stupid laws that were happening about marijuana, and that's what happened in England as well. They started to kind of get paranoid. First, the Stones, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards got busted for marijuana, and George Harrison. And during that time, Timothy Leary had left Millbrook. That had done its day. He'd moved to Laguna Beach, and in California, south of LA. And Ramdas had gone on a tour of India, basically, because he had, in his story, what happened was Ramdas had taken so much acid, and like many of the other seekers, he wanted to try and find some natural way of stabilizing consciousness and not be dependent just on LSD. And he'd gone on a journey. And when he came back in 71, it took him a while, but he published a book that was going to have a huge influence on people, because people had been following him and Timothy Leary, and they had a huge influence. And he wrote this very coherent book that was quite different to Politics of Ecstasy. Politics of Ecstasy was Timothy Leary's thing, and Bihinau was Richard Alpert's thing, and he'd now adopted the name Ramdas. And for many, this was the first time that everyone had heard this word Das. And he'd met a holy man called Nim Karoli Baba. And so the story goes, apparently, not everybody agrees, but the story, as we've been told, is that he gave a whole bunch of LSD to Nim Karoli Baba, because he asked him about it. He called it city medicine. And he observed him, and it appeared that absolutely nothing really happened to him, a huge amount. And he'd watched thousands of people take LSD, and he knew all about it, and he couldn't detect any difference. This is part of the story. And then there was another yogi there who was his kind of teacher, called Baba Haridas, who's not really mentioned in the book, but Baba Haridas came to America later and established a commune and had many students, some who I know, and they've got more stories to say about that connection with Baba Haridas, Nim Karoli Baba, and Ramdas. And just the other day, I had somebody wonderful called Mohandas, who is also a member from that time, maybe before Ramdas had met Nim Karoli Baba. And people, Nim Karoli Baba, many people afterwards, the famous chanter of Kirtan, Krishna Das, he got involved with Nim Karoli Baba at that time, and Jai Utal. Nim Karoli Baba has been very instrumental in this story. And interestingly, they've all got something different out of their connection with Nim Karoli Baba, because actually he was even though he Siddha he in Vrindavan, and he was very close with Hanuman, and it was very simple, and he used to wear a blanket, but he was actually, if you see, he wears a dhoti. He wasn't actually a sadhu, he actually had a family, but not many people knew about this. And he in Brindavan is a lot of predominantly Bengali kirtan singers, and he would have these kirtan singers coming in to do the kirtan, and Jai Uttal and Krishna Das and most of the kirtan that they've heard, and also up at the ashram that was there, that was in the Himalayas, that they had there, these kirtaniers were there, and that was what a lot of them. There's all these yoga techniques and meditation techniques, but the one that seems to be also taking off really popularly now, it's taken a long, long time. But the people, Prabhupada was the first person to really, in the West, promote kirtan. Other gurus and swamis had it there, but it wasn't predominant. They were teaching mostly other yoga techniques. And it was the chanting that had the direct influence on people who were experimenting with different techniques. The incredible nature of the Maha Mantra, and to chant it in kirtan and to chant it in japa, had a transformative effect on the consciousness of beginning to be hundreds of people all over the world. And my goodness, I'm just looking at the time. I've talked for a long, long, long time now. I think I'm going to have to stop the talk now and carry on tomorrow. But at least I brought the talk now to the point where you've got George Harrison already contacted with the Maha Mantra for a record. You've got Prabhupada has established a few disciples, and in San Francisco you've got Shamasundar, and you've got Gurudas and Mukunda and their partners, and they're all, Shamasundar has kind of come up with the idea, and they've Prabhupada has okayed it, and they all decide to go off to England with the primary mission and goal really of spreading Krishna consciousness, but also to meet the Beatles and see what would happen, because that was, and so this is all very exciting, and it's a lot to do with the proliferation and the spreading of the Maha Mantra. What to speak of the musical Hare that had just come out, and that had been a musical set in New York about someone searching for the truth, and they had seen that part of the whole hippie underground scene had been the Krishna temple, and they got the mantra idea from that and incorporated that in the musical. Plus, you had John Lennon singing on Magical Mystery Tour, I Am the Walrus, Elementary Penguin singing Hari Krishna. For some people, like my friend Gurubai Gauradas, that was the very first time he recognized the Hari Krishna, the name of Krishna. For some other people, it was Hare. And in my next part of my story, which will be probably tomorrow, I'm going to carry on the story and explain how that happened. And hopefully it's going to get to the point and I can incorporate my own personal story, because it's getting close to the point where I'm going to become Maturadas. I'm going to be influenced by this wave that's spreading all over the world magically. Hari Krishna. I'm going to sing one more song, and I'm going to sing the... what am I going to sing? I'm going to sing Jar Love. Okay. I'm going to sing Jar Love just to finish off with. Okay, it's very late. Thank you all for patiently, or if you have been watching me, watch me tomorrow. It's been a long talk. There's a lot to say, and I hope you found it interesting. And for many, it will be stuff that you already know, and for many, it will be quite new. There's lots of names, and I've had to do a little brush up to get my head around all of the different names, but thank you. So here we have Jar Love, which I wrote with Pranaji. Jar is another name of God. It's the first song that I ever wrote in my late 40s with Prana. The moon shines brightly tonight, and the stars in the heavens immersed in light. We are connected to all. I dance to the rhythm of life, and I feel your love within my soul. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Your Jala, rain down on me. Sisters and brothers, please hear my song. Man, I've but a short time to live. Don't want to get it wrong. Reality is not what it seems, what it appears to be. Beyond the veil of illusion lies real identity. Oh, drink deep from the chalice of wisdom. Eat hearty the fruits of Jala. Drink deep from the chalice of wisdom. Eat hearty the fruits of Jala. With the final curtain, you come and take your bow. Leave the magic theater, the one you're in right now. Life come round full circle, you can come back again. Go through the same old story till you don't know when your love. But when you're feeling your love, you fill your heart and soul. You're not come back here no more, 'cause Jah take you home. Your love rain down on me. Join in, please. Your love rain down on me. Join in with this as well. Drink deep from the chalice of wisdom. Eat hearty the fruits of your love. Drink deep from the chalice of wisdom. Eat hearty the fruits of your love. Your love, your love. Ooh. Sisters and brothers, each one a star. Take hold of your courage, embrace your power. The prophets have spoken, the system will fall. Awaken your children, we herald the dawn. Your love rain down on me. Your love rain down on me. The moon shines brightly tonight, and the stars in the heavens immersed in light. We are connected We are connected to all. We are connected, connected, connected to all, to all, to all, to all, to all, to all. Jah love. And not just to rain on me, to rain on all of us. Hari Om. Thank you so much for joining me again and my live share. And I hope that you're not experiencing anxiety and too many challenges, or that you or your family are not experiencing effects from the virus. But I do know quite a few people now whose family, Aniha, his wife Gayatri, she's been in the hospital, and I really pray that she pulls through. Our godbrother Dhananjaya, who's very important in the early days of the Krishna movement, he's apparently recovering from hospital, and there's many more, Jamuna and other people. So it is real. People are getting affected by the coronavirus, whatever people say, and I wish them and their family and friends love and peace and healing, and to get through it and to face the challenges. Please stay in your power. Find some way to not to keep out the anxiety and the fear that you may be experiencing about the strange times we live in. And I send my love and wishing love and peace in the world and on everybody. And thanks again. Hari Om. I'll be here tomorrow. I think I'm going to choose the same time. It worked well for me. I'll be interested to know. You can leave comments. Do you think 8:30 is a better time? Does it fit in if you're interested? But, if you've missed this, you might be watching it afterwards, and that's fine as well. Okay. Lots of love. Hari Om.